But no, this is really good. So Glenn Scrivener is this guy right here. He's got a YouTube channel, Speak Life. I've been sort of paying attention to him now for a number of years. I'm not sure I would line up with him on every jot and tittle of theology, but he is really paying attention to the cultural moment that we're in. And I think he's exactly right. A lot of people are seeing this, that there's been a tide change in the last, I would say, less than 5 years regarding just sort of like the what's acceptable to say about the Bible, God, Christianity, church attendance. It is changing. It's changing at the highest levels amongst people who have a lot of cultural sway. And I really think this is huge, because you've got people who, like Jordan Peterson, who is, as far as I can tell, definitely not a Christian at this point. He is big into Bible study. His lectures on Genesis and Exodus have gotten, I don't know, tens, hundreds of millions of views, probably at least tens of millions of views at this point. Now, he comes at them from a psychological standpoint, viewing everything through the lens of Carl Jung, who was kind of a protege of Sigmund Freud. Carl Jung saw the Bible through these archetypes. He didn't take it as literal. He didn't take it as these events actually happened. He doesn't care if there was actually a Noah and an ark. He doesn't care if there was actually a Jesus who rose from the dead. He doesn't care if there's an actual Cain who murdered Abel. He just sees these stories as extraordinarily sophisticated archetypes, apparently. I've never read Jung, but that's the gist I get from Peterson. So Peterson sees them as being unbelievably valuable stories that have survived for millennia, and therefore really have stood the test of time and tell us lots of important things, baseline things about human beings and how we work and how we're supposed to work and what we're supposed to aim for and what we're supposed to avoid. Of course, screaming the whole time, I'm just going, is it objectively true? Is it historically true? That's all I care about. Did Jesus really die and rise for our sins? Peterson doesn't seem to be able to get at that question, seems to be annoyed by the question. Do you believe in God, or do you believe Jesus bodily rose from the dead? He only cares about the psychological side of these things. However you look at it, he is at least giving some kind of positive cultural credibility to the Bible, even if it's not based in the objective world, which it must be from a Christian perspective. And he's not teaching Christianity. He's not preaching the gospel. He's not. But he is talking about the Bible in a way that is not easily scoffed at by our culture. So even though his gospel presentation is no gospel, and although what he says about the Bible is almost entirely off base and wrongly founded, he's at least putting tens of millions of lectures out into the public sphere that are being listened to, especially by young men. And he's saying the Bible is not something you should throw out and throw away and forget about. Maybe the stuff that your grandparents taught when you were growing up and what your pastor taught at the church you occasionally visited, maybe there's something actually to that. And so young men especially are sitting around going, well, let me pay more attention to this. Then you're on the back end of the New Atheist movement. The New Atheist movement has really lived and died. It was they've said, a Christian. It was an anti-Christian publishing movement, and you had Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. And I really do wish Hitchens were around today just to hear what he would say about a lot of things. But he has passed away, but the rest of them are still living. And Dawkins has got to be in his 80s now. But Dawkins is seeing that there's a tide change right now. And Islam is on the rise in a big way in the world. And you've got sort of Chinese communism, and you've got wokeness, which is leaning toward a kind of communism. You've got kind of communism type wokeness, or you've got Islam, or you've got Christianity. Those are the three choices, Western man. Which shall you choose? Europe is going toward Islam right now in a big way. And that's the question, is what are we going to do with all this? So there seems to be a rebirth in the conversation about God, and it's much less looked down upon to say, I'm going to church. I've been visiting a church. I've been reading the Bible some. I've been wanting, that stuff, that's big. That's a difference from 5 years ago. And so let's keep listening.
This huge values gap over sexuality, absolutely enormous. And we see that driving a lot of the institutional pain and conflict at the moment. And for most of the people that are coming to this sense of, okay, maybe what I'm looking for is less of an individualized spiritual path and more of the whisper it, old school religion, jumping that gap, becoming part of an institution that might hold a radically different view on sexuality from yourself is a really big question mark.
She has named it all. That's exactly it.
Well, are you an atheist capitalizing on a kind of misplaced Christian yearning?
I'm an atheist, but so are most of the people that we're talking about. This is the thing. Of course, it's not really cool to be an atheist anymore. When new atheism springs up, which is essentially a publishing phenomenon, by the way, nothing more. There's sort of, what is it that's new about new atheism? Well, it's disbelief in God with all of the political stuff. It sort of is indebted to 9/11 for its existence, for example. It probably wouldn't spring up without that.
That is exactly right. So the big publishing wave of the new atheist movement came as a reaction to 9/11. That's what Christopher Hitchens said. Christopher Hitchens has been writing for Vanity Fair. He wasn't really big and out about being an atheist. He said when 9/11 happened, I could no longer stay quiet, and that's when he wrote God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And then you had, right around that time, Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion, which became infamous. Sam Harris wrote Letter to a Christian Nation. Daniel Dennett wrote, I think, about I never read his book. I never read most of their books, but Daniel Dennett wrote the book about evolution.
People, the biggest thing that I think people get wrong about this is they talk about it as if it's some kind of new phenomenon, this meaning crisis. Like the panel that you moderated, the discussion I had with John Vervaeke was finding meaning in a secular age, which is quite a strange thing to say, as if this struggle to find meaning, this chasm of meaning is something new. It's as if it weren't the case that Scripture itself is littered with examples of people desperately yearning for God, and this isn't a new thing. Like, what's actually new here? Well, okay, Richard Dawkins publishes The God Delusion in 2006, and since then people are getting more depressed. Young people are finding it difficult to foster meaningful conversations with each other and have communion with each other, and they're staying indoors and isolated. They're not getting together because they're not going to church. Maybe. What also happened in 2007? The invention of the iPhone. We have all these conversations about finding meaning in a secular age. What about finding meaning in the technological age? No, that would be a weird event to put on.
Sure, I completely agree that the smartphone and technology and social media and now AI are incredible technological shocks that we are not ready for and that we are handling poorly. Interestingly, in Jonathan Haidt's kind of data, he seems to say that actually the most religious communities are surviving those tech shocks best. So that's one thing to throw in here.
But I think we're probably far more depressed and nihilistic because of that, because of social media addiction, because of being confronted daily by thousands of people with completely conflicting worldviews that make you think, well, of course I can't be right about this. And you can go to church now, but when you go to church, you realize that when you come home, you're going to listen to people halfway across the world who've just been to their equivalent of church and been taught something totally different. Being confronted with that on a daily basis probably has something to do with our inability to believe in God. So we talk about figures like Douglas Murray, like Tom Holland, like Jordan Peterson. These are people that you talk about in your book, Justin. None of these people will explicitly say that they believe in God, you know? And those that do, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, have said explicitly that the reason they do so is because you were there as well at the event where Ayaan just spoke to Richard Dawkins. And she gave a very moving account. It was almost comical the way that she sort of talks about her incredible story of depression and suicidality and manages to crawl out of it by praying. And then Richard Dawkins has to go, yes, but do you believe in the virgin birth? Like, you know, that's the important thing. Like, that was
tough to respond.
So Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a woman, I'm not as familiar with her. I think she was kind of in a forced Muslim background, that she became more of an atheist. She saw Dawkins as someone she looked up to. I think she's got a PhD, brilliant. Again, I don't know a lot about her, but she went out within the last year or so and claimed to be a believer in Jesus and had become a Christian. A lot of people were skeptical. I really just don't know. But in a recent interview that he's just talking about, she's on stage with Richard Dawkins being interviewed, and she says, "Dear Richard, you know, you're a person I've looked up to, but like basically I found something in Christ that I have never found anywhere else. I was suicidal, I was depressed, and I reached out and I called out to God and to Christ, and he changed everything. He completely brought joy where I was on the verge of suicide." And Dawkins responds with the questions of the virgin birth, which again, I don't think that's that funny, really. I mean, that's a completely legitimate thing to talk about. But Dawkins is starting to see people around him who've been influenced by him through the new atheist movement, and he's going, wow, what's going on? Like, the new atheist movement has really lost steam. Like Alex O'Connor said, it was cool 10 years ago to say you were an atheist. Today, it's not as cool. And it was super uncool 10 years ago to say you were a Bible-believing, inerrantist, Scripture-believing person. Today, saying you're open to the Bible is not mocked nearly as quickly.
But Ayaan said, I choose to believe it. She said, I'm so moved by the personal aspect that I just choose to believe that what they're saying is true. A lot of people tell me that I have a God-shaped hole. It seems to me that maybe Ayaan has a hole-shaped God, right? Like, it's no surprise to me that this is what's happening.
A hole-shaped God. So she has a need for meaning, and so she has constructed a God that is the plug for that. And the contours of that God has been determined by her ache for more rather than what's actually there. I mean, Ayaan herself doesn't talk in those terms. Her therapist said to her, if you could construct a God, which God would you construct? And she discovered that in that process, she was describing Jesus Christ. And so she thought at that point, I need to be dealing with the God who was before me. rather than a God that I have constructed for myself. But it's a good point. If we're constantly talking about the God-shaped whole, we might just use God for instrumental purposes, and then all God becomes is some salve to the meaning crisis, rather than God.
Sure. Wow, I want to pause Glenn where he doesn't look strange there. So yeah, so that's a fair point. But this is interesting that Richard Dawkins has a video recently where he talks about, I've always called myself, he says, a cultural Christian. Of course, I'm not a real Christian, but I love the cathedrals and the bells and the songs and the Christmas carols and the hymns and that kind of, well, what he's saying is he loves the effects in culture that Christianity's brought about. He says he far prefers a Christian culture to a Islamic culture. He's like, that's not even a question. I take a Christian culture over Islamic culture 1,000 times out of 1,000. I think he says something like that. And so the point, though, is this. Richard Dawkins has spent his entire adult life using atheism and Darwinian evolution in an attempt to cut down the Christian apple tree. And when he finally feels like he started to succeed in cutting down the Christian apple tree, the tree, he thinks, falls over on the ground. He's killed it. He's uprooted it. He's destroyed it. He's cut it down. And he's demanding that the branches continue to produce the Christian apples of a Christian culture. But the problem is you just cut the thing down. And if you cut it down, what's going to happen is in a culture over time, the fruit that comes from the root is going to be cut off and it's not going to be produced in the long run. But when a branch has just been cut off, it may still continue to blossom fruit for a few days before it begins drying up. And as a culture goes, when you kill Christianity, I know you can't kill Christianity. God is still there no matter what. But if in your mind you've gotten rid of Christianity, the fruits of a Christian worldview will continue to bear fruit for a period of decades, but then even that will begin to shrivel up. And what we've seen since 2020 especially is what the chaotic, anarchic craziness and wokeness and critical theory, all the stuff that's come in place of Christianity in the last 4 or 5 years, and people are realizing, oh my goodness, I can't appeal to an atheist worldview to combat this stuff. I need something grounded and objective. I need an objective standard to counter this stuff, and that's the Christian worldview. That's the Christian God.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Alex.
Of course, people are going to be sort of like depressed and nihilistic for a while after something like the technological revolution. Maybe also new atheism is partly responsible for that. I mean, for a while it's kind of cool, you know. Oh, there's no meaning; it's all just molecules and motions. Like, do you perceive your mother with that worldview?
Do you observe?
See, so Alex O'Connor is saying something that's absolutely brilliant there. The molecules in motion worldview, the idea that we're just random byproducts of an accidental collocation of atoms, that the universe blew up out of nothing, and that by chance it just happened to be that it was completely dialed perfectly fine-tuned for life, and that we happen to be on a Goldilocks planet that's just the perfect everything to support life, and that we evolved from a single self-replicating cell that came from non-life and created life and replicated itself and became all kinds of organic life forms, including plants and animals and people and all that stuff. But we have no objective purpose. We're here for no objective meaning. There is no objective right and wrong. As Richard Dawkins said in his book, River Out of Eden, A Darwinian View of Life, he says, the universe has the kind of properties at bottom that we would expect if there was at bottom no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, and no justice. And so if that's what you preach and teach long enough, eventually the culture will begin to act like there's no meaning. But then Alex O'Connor says, but when you go home and talk to your mom, you know that your mom matters, objectively. It's written on your heart. It's written, he wouldn't say this, but God has written that on your conscience. You know certain things deeply, profoundly. You can't unlearn them. You know that your mom matters. You know that there's objective worth in that relationship, that she really counts. She's not just random bumping molecules. She's a human being who matters. So when you go home, you don't say that.
So new atheism is partly responsible for that. I mean, for a while it's kind of cool, you know. Oh, there's no meaning; it's all just molecules and motions. Like, do you perceive your mother with that worldview?
Do you observe, though, the same thing that these guys have been talking about? That, I mean, rather than we can have a discussion about new atheism, but what about the past few years? You said it's no longer cool to be so atheist, and I noticed when we did our panel at that same conversation, you quoted from C.S. Lewis' Surprised by Joy, which surprised your atheist fan base that were out there in the audience to see you. You know, regardless of the kind of deep truths of it, do you observe at least as a kind of cultural phenomenon that religion is in?
Religion is, I think, like Liz says, is just less condemnable than it was 10 years ago.
Okay.
Because
that's absolutely true. Christianity in the town square, in the popular square, is far less loathsome to our culture than it was, excuse me, did I say that backwards? 10 years ago, it was far more loathsome than it is right now. Just use Joe Rogan as an example. Joe Rogan is a profane man, uses tons of bad language, definitely not a Christian. But here's the thing, Joe Rogan, they've shown clips of his from 5 or 6 years ago, and he just bashes Christianity and the Bible with vehemence and cursing. He just says, if you believe in the New Testament and the Old Testament, you believe those things are true, those stories are actual, that's a bunch of mythology, you're an idiot, you're blah, 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 blah. He just goes off on you. And that's 5, 6 years ago, Joe Rogan. That's pre-2020 Joe Rogan. Well, Joe Rogan in the last couple of years, he's having on lots of Christians on his podcast, which has got 17 million subscribers. Spotify just put out their subscription list publicly for the first time a few months ago, and Joe Rogan is 17 million. I think the next biggest podcast has like 10 or less million. So Joe Rogan's podcast is almost twice as big as the second biggest in the world, or at least on Spotify. And so Joe Rogan is the biggest thing on the internet as far as podcasts go, and nothing comes close second. And Joe Rogan, who has massive influence culturally and probably internationally, Joe Rogan goes from cursing the Bible to having people like Jordan Peterson and even like guys like Hulk Hogan who go on there, and Hulk Hogan's wearing a John 3:16 shirt. I'm like, Hulk Hogan is a professing Christian? And Hulk Hogan's trying to present the gospel. Of course, he mixes it up with a whole bunch of nonsense while he's there. But he's had all kinds of guests come on recently who are Christians to one degree or another. Some of them seem to be genuine Christians. Some of them are at least playing around with Christianity, but they're saying positive things about Jesus. He had Stephen C. Meyer, the intelligent design Christian scientist. He's brilliant, and he went on there recently and talked about his belief in Christ and the resurrection, and he's a super brilliant, genius kind of guy. But anyways, this has been going on, so now Joe Rogan is softening. He doesn't believe Christianity is objectively true. He does not think for a second Jesus actually rose from the dead, at least not yet. I would love to see him become a Christian, but no. But Joe Rogan is saying things like the Bible is valuable, and like, he's like, Jesus, if you're going to come back, now would be a good time. He's like, I'm not even kidding. He's like, Jesus, you should come back. So he's saying things tongue-in-cheek, but kind of more serious than joking about how the Bible is very good, and people need religion to like stabilize themselves and to not fall into anarchy and chaos. And so when you have these massive voices saying those kinds of things, and another one I'd mention is Dominion, written by, I'll forget his name. I'll think of it in a second. It's the same name as the actor who played Spider-Man, Tom Holland. Tom Holland. When I mention him in class, people think I'm talking about the kid who played Spider-Man. Tom Holland, who did a big book, which I've got. I have not read but the beginning of it, but the huge book Dominion, it's about that thick. And he's arguing for the incredibly positive influence Christianity has had on Western society and the world over the last 2 millennia because of the idea of God being on a cross and dying for sinners. He said put that into the bloodstream of a culture. It's going to change society, how you view everybody, how you do everything. And so that's been a very influential book that came out in 2019.
In the midst of, as I say, a publishing phenomenon where people were sort of talking about it casually in the pub. If you turn on like Fox News, people were debating evolution in schools. Now they're talking about school bathrooms, right? Like it's very commonplace to go into a pub. We could walk down to the Westminster Arms around the corner, and you probably find people talking about woke culture, gender ideology, this kind of stuff. People are just talking about it at the pub in a way that they're not talking about religion anymore. And that means that the only people who are left to talk about religion are people who are reflecting on it properly. It's not just part of the sort of cultural zeitgeist. So who's left to talk about it? People who've put enough thought into it to recognize that it's too simplistic to just say, oh, that's stupid, you know, you must be an idiot.
It's interesting. I'm watching this for the first time, just so you know. So I'm hearing this part for the first time. It's interesting that he says that it used to be 10, 15 years ago, everything after 9/11. So I know if you're 20 right now, you don't remember pre-9/11, that's okay. I was in 9th grade, so I was 14 when 9/11 happened, September of 2001, of course. And what you have is after that, the idea is that there's bad people in every worldview, but if you want to become really bad, you have to put religion and God in the driver's seat. That was the belief that was pumped into our culture after 9/11 was, yeah, sure, there's bad Marxists, there's bad atheists, there's bad Christians, there's bad Muslims, but here's what. If you want to make someone ultra bad, put belief in God into the mix, and you have an ultra villain, someone who's going to blow up towers, kill thousands of people who don't deserve that. So that's a huge part of what's going on. I'll fix my microphone here. And so what was talked about was, man, if we want to fix society, we need to get rid of God and religion. And that's why the New Atheist movement took off. But now people are not looking at Christianity and they're not looking at the Bible as being the problem with society. They're not saying it's created some problem in society. They still would see Islam as a major factor. I think anyone who's looking around is going to say Islam is going to be pretty intense on what it will do to a society. And that is not desirable to most people, thankfully, at this point. So what are people left with? They're left with, maybe we need God. And instead of saying God and the Bible are causing the problems, which is what people said after 9/11, lumping Christianity and the gospel in with Islam, which was an unfair lumping together, obviously. But now they're saying, well, transgender bathrooms in public schools. the transgender ideology in public schools, the kind of sexual deviancy that's being taught to our children, the kind of stuff that's coming in through entertainment, through public broadcasting and all kinds of things online. That's the real danger to society. And we know the Bible does not support these things. Let's go back to Christianity in order to solve this conundrum, this problem.
And that stuff.
But the thought leaders trickle down in terms of how everyone else starts to talk about it. So that does have an effect, I think, in how everybody else starts talking about religion, I would say.
It doesn't necessarily mean that people have sort of shifted their opinion. If you went into the Westminster Arms and said, I know no one's talking about this, but what do you all think about Christianity? They'd probably say, oh, I don't believe in any of that kind of stuff. I think the same thing would probably be the case. It's just that less people are talking about it now.
I don't think that's true. I think when Russell Brand with 6.5 million Awakening Wonders on YouTube gets baptized and they do Mere Christianity as the book club for his supporters, I think this is changing some of the conversation.
Let me just say a word about that. So Russell Brand is the actor who, I don't know, he was in some movies 10 years ago. Super charismatic, intelligent guy with a huge vocabulary, almost speaks poetry. It's almost hard to follow him when he's talking. So Russell Brand was the ultimate playboy. He was extremely sexually deviant and wore it on his sleeve. He was a true hedonist. He would party. He would sleep around. He was all about sexual stuff and all that. He was trying to find meaning in all those things. He would have a cross tattooed to his arm, but he also had several other religions, symbols tattooed all over his body. And I am not for one second saying I know at all that Russell Brand's become a Christian. I'm highly skeptical that he's truly become a Christian, although I would love for that to be the case. But Russell Brand, I remember something weird happened about 5 years ago. He started talking about how pornography is not a good thing. I thought, that's weird. I did not expect that guy to say that thing. And he said several other things that I thought were remarkable. I actually quoted him in a sermon about 5 years ago because he said some remarkably insightful things as a kind of an atheist hedonist. Well, then he kind of went from atheist hedonism, nihilism, playboy stuff into sort of this sort of mystical thing where he was kind of like into every religion and belief system. He would quote all different religions, and he was kind of like, I don't know if it was Western or it was kind of Eastern New Age kind of stuff. He got into this weird kind of paganism of that sort. Well, just in the last year, he's gravitated back to what he kind of had exposed to growing up, I think, which was Christianity. He starts talking about how he's reading the book of Galatians. I'm thinking, that's not what I was expecting Russell Brand to say. Russell Brand says he's been reading Galatians, and then he says he's getting baptized, he's become a Christian, he now believes in Jesus, that Jesus died for his sins. Now, I'm not saying I know that Russell Brand is a Christian. We saw Kanye West appear to have been a Christian, and now he is clearly not a Christian. Kanye West has fallen, sadly, far away. So I have no idea where Russell Brand's at. I'm highly skeptical, but guys like that, we're talking big-name celebrities with lots of money and lots of influence and lots of followers online, are now no longer mocking Christianity and living the playboy lifestyle. They're starting to go, hey, maybe there's something to this, and they're gravitating back to the Christianity that they were exposed to some as children.
That's happening, and sort of anecdotally, I'm noticing in my church and in my town, I'm noticing in the other churches that I visit, there are more such people who are more likely to give church a shot and to start talking about those big issues. But maybe that's just anecdote.
I disagree. I think there has been a genuine shift in general openness to supernatural.
Okay, let me say a word here before we get lost. This is Justin Briley right here. He was the host of the Unbelievable podcast, which I think was in London, and great podcast. He would have people would come on and debate, like for instance, N.T. Wright debated James White on justification. That's a phenomenal episode. Or you had Bart Ehrman debated Peter Williams on the reliability of the Gospels. There's lots of really good debates on that. Now, Justin Briley, theologically, we're going to be very different. He's Arminian. I'm Reformed, more Calvinistic. His wife is his pastor. I found that out during the COVID lockdown when they did church at home, and his wife was the pastor. I was like, oh boy. So we're going to be really different from Justin Briley on theological issues, and I really don't know much about this lady either. I don't know almost anything about her, so I think my first time maybe seeing her. So I'm not supporting everything anyone on this video is saying theologically, but he's doing a podcast, Justin Briley, called The Surprising Rebirth in Belief in God. Something like that, The Surprising Rebirth and the Belief in God. And although we're going to differ with his doctrine, I recommend the podcast. It's fascinating. He talks about all the things that we're talking about in this video, but at much more depth and length, and it's hours and hours long, and it's totally fascinating as he walks through a lot of these cultural figures and how he believes that there really is a sea change right now in terms of cultural longing for God and a move back to the biblical God.
Claims in that sense. So I think it is easier to talk without embarrassment about religion. I think it was much harder in the heyday of New Atheists because it was just, the cool kids were the Sam Harrises and the Dawkins and so on. And I just feel like, partly because of the influence of some of those people you've mentioned, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland and others, who have just sort of said, A, new atheists really overreached, and B, it turns out we all basically need religion at some level. We're all kind of intrinsically religious. And C, it turns out, despite everything the new atheists said, Christianity's done an awful lot of good for us, and they've just kind of helped to remind people of sort of some of the fundamental things that Christianity gave the West. And I just think that has actually had quite a significant impact, because these are people with very large platforms. And I think you do get a trickle down, even into the pub, of people saying, oh, you know, I just listened to Joe Rogan say, it's about time we had Jesus back, or whatever. Now, it's not necessarily high-level intellectual thesis, but it's just a change in the way people are willing to talk about things. And even Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I think, her saying, I just choose to believe it now. I don't think that's her surrendering her intellectual faculties. I think it's her saying, I've discovered something that is does not compete with my intellectual, faculties, but it comes in alongside it, and I realise that it doesn't have to be this either-or any longer.
So this will become the absolute heart of this conversation. Can you choose to believe something, and can you take Ayaan's path with any kind of credibility? Can you choose to believe in the virgin birth? Can you choose to become a Christian like that simply because you feel a meaning crisis, or because you see the political threat of Islam and woke ideology in China and Iran? And is that enough to make you just say, all right, I believe the creed now. I believe in the virgin birth. I believe in the resurrection. How do you make that leap? It is thought of as a leap from being a rational person to being a believing person. And the rest of this conversation, there are some wonderful moments, especially from Elizabeth Oldfield, about how that is not actually a leap, and how actually going to church and praying is precisely the thing that makes Christianity plausible. It's not the
Let me say here, the idea of it being a leap to believe in the biblical God and the virgin birth and the resurrection. And I think it was actually Glenn Scrivener on another video said this, you know, if you reject the biblical God and you reject the virgin conception and the resurrection of Jesus, if you reject that as being mythological fairy tale nonsense that we have no scientific backing for, we've never seen it before, Scrivener says, oh, well, let's say back to Dawkins, you already believe in miracles. You believe the whole universe came from nothing, from no creator by accident. That's a miracle without a God. You also believe that life came from non-life. Self-replicating cells, which are the most complex thing you could imagine, came from what? Slime that got struck by lightning, some sort of random process. This is absurdity. You already believe in things that have never been observed scientifically. Have we ever seen a universe come into existence out of a big bang from nothing? Have we ever seen life come from non-life spontaneously? No, it's non-scientific. It's simply a leap to believe those things. And so biblical Christianity, yes, it has miracles in it, like a virgin conception and a resurrection, but it has a God behind all that stuff that makes logically perfect sense out of all that we see and hear.
Once you've found Christianity plausible for rational reasons, it's the thing that becomes rationally plausible as you pray, as you go to church, as you read scripture. But Freddie's going to reflect on Ayaan Hirsi Ali's journey.
I mean, in Ayaan's case, what's interesting is that her first essay that she wrote here, Unheard, sounded more political. It was a kind of sense that the West, as a collective society, is without moral foundations, and if we're going to find a way to rejuvenate, we need to rediscover Christianity. And then her subsequent accounts of it, which she started talking to me, and then I thought particularly a few weeks ago, were much more personal, where she talked about having had a really, really terrible period and how it helped her get out of it. So she is the kind of fusion of the political Christian and the faithful spiritual Christian. Can we really separate those two things, do you think? This question of more political Christianity or a sort of pragmatic decision to resurrect Christianity because we seem to be screwed without it, versus actually engendering kind of authentic spiritual revival in individuals.
I wouldn't see it in such binary terms as that. I think what we're seeing is the falling away of the myth that we make decisions based on arguments.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm with her on this. Again, I don't know who she is. I don't know anything about her. But I'm with her on this point. We are not simply rational creatures. That is a myth. So the idea that we simply just function on just the facts, ma'am, just tell me what's true and that I'm going to believe it, as if that's the atheist worldview. It's just, no, that's not true. Ephesians 4 would say this. It says the Gentiles, the pagans, are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of their hearts. At rock bottom, their ignorance and their false belief system is rooted in a hardness of heart. It's the wrong loves and values and longings of the life that you want to justify. The brain is so often brought along behind to justify the heart, rather than putting the brain forward in logical progress in order to have the heart follow alongside. No. People oftentimes do what they desire most. And that's what she's getting
at all, really. I think there's very good evidence that.
Notice Alex O'Connor nodding, right? I mean, he's a radical emotivist, so like he goes all the way with this. He doesn't even think that there's such a thing as truth at the end of the day. It's just that the law of logical non-contradiction just can't be held in our minds. We just go boo to that. We go yuck to that. We just emotionally reject logical fallacies. And actually, what comes first is our emotions. What comes first is our desire. So Alex is going to go way down the track with what Elizabeth is saying here. But what Elizabeth is saying here is that we are heart-driven creatures, right? And that our reason is so often rationalizing rather than rational.
There's very good evidence that we come to our conclusions about things based on the relationships that we're in and the people that we trust and the stories that make sense to us.
Wow. Say that again.
There's very good evidence that we come to our conclusions about things based on the relationships that we're in and the people that we trust and the stories that make sense to us.
The relationships that we're in, the people that we trust, the stories that make sense to us. This is the plausibility structures. We did a video here last week on plausibility structures, the ways in which we start to believe things. It's not so much that we think our way into a new way of living, it's that we live our way into a new way of thinking. That's what Elizabeth is on about here.
The idea that Christians or atheists or anyone in between is going, right, where's the logic here? Let me just plot this on a spreadsheet. Okay, that's the path that I'm gonna use to lead my, and Christians, I think, bought that lie for a while and decided if we can just meet these arguments, if we can just come up with a cosmology, if we can just make this neat and tidy and palatable for this very thin, narrow definition of reason, then we'll be able to persuade people. There are possibly some people whose formation means they think in maths, essentially, who might need that. Most of us don't. People who have had a broad attention to the world, who are, I think, trying to live wisely and deeply, know that our decisions are made, and these deepest decisions about who to love, these things that define our lives, the things that we say at our funerals are existential and emotional and embodied and relational.
Ooh, say that again.
Are existential and emotional and embodied and relational.
Existential, emotional, embodied, relational. Oh, she's on fire, Elizabeth.
And so the sort of new atheist moment, and I include some Christians in that, has ebbed. And what you're left with is the truer thing. That we as humans, actually, most of us long for unconditional love. And we long to be seen, and we long to be known, and we long for a deep intimacy, and we long for our lives to mean something, and we long to be part of a story.
Okay, I'm not going to agree with every word of what she's just said, but she's onto something there to say, deep down, we know our life has to count. We know that things are objectively true. We know that things are objectively right and wrong. That is stamped on us by the image of God. Romans 1, they know that those who practice such things deserve to die, but they not only do them, but they give approval to those who practice those such things. The law of God is stamped so deeply into our conscience that we know that the certain things we participate in are worthy of death, which is why the wicked flee when no man pursues, but the righteous are as strong as a lion or as bold as a lion, because the wicked know that they're guilty. They know that they're under God's judgment, and yet they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. They push those thoughts away that are presented to them so clearly through the conscience God has given.
In ourselves. And that's hard to find on your own. And even if you are going because you're like, okay, it's not working politically, even if you're going because you're like, okay, we can't base morality without this, even if you're going because you've decided that the anti-Muslim rhetoric, which I find very troubling, is right, eventually, if it's going to be anything real to you, you have to drop down to that level. And you see Ayaan Hirsi Ali doing that in a way that I think is so courageous and so humanizing and so vulnerable. And I am grateful for it.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. I mean, just listen to that on repeat again and again and again. She mentioned a lot about the biggest choices we have are about who to love. And there's something very Augustinian about that. You know, the North African theologian from 4th, 5th century. Ordering our loves is wise living. Disordered loves is exactly what's wrong with human beings. We love things, but we love the wrong things, or we love the right things in the wrong proportion, and we have disordered loves. And that's what's going wrong in your life. It's what's going wrong in my life. Properly ordered loves is what makes us wise, and therefore that wisdom is the grid through which we will actually rationally understand the world. And
I totally agree with that. That is what Augustine taught. That our fundamental problem is disordered loves, and that redemption is being forgiven and then also restored to where our loves are ordered properly and proportionally. That's what the Christian life's about. It's about loving the right things in the right proportion, in the right order. And if you get that right, you're the happiest person in the world.
We cannot, by ourselves, simply, rationally make decisions according to evidence without actually being embodied, without actually being in community, without actually figuring out the livability of what it is that we're talking about. It's an existential issue, she says, as well as embodied, and it's relational. And so it is not simply the case that most of us, most of the time, live these rational lives, individually choosing the good because of our intellect, and then we make the decision, oh, perhaps I need to go to church. It's go to church. If you don't believe in God, go to church and figure it out. If you don't believe in God, pray and figure it out. If you don't believe in God, submit yourself to the scriptures, surrender to that story. It's not a case of first figure out whether you can be a person who assents to all the items of the creed and then, find out the opening times on Sunday mornings. It doesn't work like that. Christianity doesn't work like that because life doesn't work like that, because you don't work like that. We are heart-driven creatures. How is Freddie going to respond to this?
So, Alex, what Liz is almost talking about is a retreat of rationality, in effect. It's,
Whoa.
as a kind of...
Oh my goodness, look at the look on Elizabeth's face. It's a retreat of rationality, says Freddie Sayers. And she's like, no, I'm not saying that. I'm giving you the context in which rationality truly functions. And rationality is always woven together with our loves and with a greater story and with community and with embodiment and with existential questions. She's not saying let's get rid of rationality so that we can do the community thing. Retreats of rationality. Look at, I love that. Look at Elizabeth's face. That's a picture.
Whoa.
As a single organizing principle, it does feel, you were talking about the post 9/11 period.
She's like, whoa, that's not what I'm saying. But
is what I would say. Just say a proper and needed broadening of the definition of rationality is what I would say.
Yeah, along with some of the groaners, I think that might have been an unfair characterization of what was just said. I think I basically agree in that there is an inappropriateness in bringing questions of essentially empiricism and maths into questions of meaning and narrative. It's as inappropriate as me walking into a science lab where somebody's trying to figure out how many molecules are in this glass in front of me and me saying, I can help you with that, here's a nice poem. It would be ridiculous and ludicrous. And I think it's just as silly when somebody like Ayaan Hirsi Ali is telling the story of her life and about her relationship with God. And in Christianity, belief in God is not so much belief in an entity as relationship with a person, right? That's what it's supposed to be about. And I think it's just as inappropriate to walk into there and say, well, I can help you with that, here's some science. And that's where you end up with a Richard Dawkins and a sort of an inability to get anywhere in conversation. I mean, you were there, I don't know if you'll agree with this.
So, I do think a poet helps.
Of approaching the world just come together and clash, and you basically get to decide not necessarily who you think is right, but whose approach you prefer. And I do think I agree. The one thing I definitely agree with is that this non-propositional this narrative, this almost poetic approach to these questions is beginning to win out. That's what's definitely changing. The problem is that doesn't give you the belief in God, always. I mean, for someone like Ayan, she's able to just sort of choose to believe it. And to be clear, I'm very happy for her. I'm envious of her. I wish I could do that for myself. I find myself unable. But one thing that's been not mentioned...
You wish you could do what? Sorry.
To just choose to believe this stuff. I think it'd be wonderful.
So you would choose to be a Christian?
Yeah, I think anybody who... at least the kind of Christianity that I understand, or the Christianity that I've sort of read through the person of Jesus, for example, I think anybody who says that they don't want it to be true, that they wouldn't worship that God even if he existed, that new atheist line, just doesn't know what they're talking about, or is talking about a different kind of Christianity or a different kind of God.
If you don't think things have changed, just play that last 30 seconds on a loop. Things have changed. When Alex O'Connor...
That's amazing. I mean, I have listened to Alex O'Connor just a little bit here and there for several, at least, I don't want to exaggerate, at least 5 years, maybe more. I don't know. I've seen him around for a while on YouTube, and I've even shown some parts of his videos in class because they're very helpful in discussions with atheism. He's the one that said in debate that rape is not objectively wrong because nothing is objectively wrong as an atheist. He was questioned on that in multiple settings, and he said, I wouldn't say it's objectively wrong. He said, I find it horribly distasteful. I don't like it. I would want to stop it, kind of a thing, but I wouldn't say it's objectively wrong. So now he's saying anybody with a thinking mind would want the Christianity presented by Jesus to be true, even if he can't yet get himself to believe it. That's pretty amazing.
Says stuff like that.
An important thing, though, that I think hasn't been mentioned yet is that this is... well, I suppose you were just kind of mentioning it there, is the political dimension here. So much of this, like you say, Ayan's original article for Unheard was a political essay. It was lambasting woke culture, Islamism, a few other things, like China, Russia, this kind of stuff. It was a political essay.
There were also personal aspects to even that first article, and certainly predating that first article was her ARC conference panel discussion where she spoke about this, and again spoke about it in personal terms too.
And I do think that a lot of this revival, if there is such a thing, is actually a political revival, a sort of protest against secular liberalism that people are beginning to see as failing. I mean, Ayan said to Richard Dawkins, atheism doesn't give you anything. This is the problem. It doesn't give you anything to live on. And Dawkins says, well, we have rational secular humanism, as if putting rational before what you find, aesthetically most pleasing. It turns it into an ethical theory. Ayan says, look, it's not working, Richard. It's obviously this isn't working for people. And Dawkins says, oh, we've just got to try harder, which I think is incredibly naive. I don't think it's doing the trick. So
but
in
what else
response
could
to
he say at that point? Yeah.
Without sort of having to say that he might be wrong about that, I suppose not much. But I do think he's wrong in what he said. I think he's wrong about that. I don't think that secular humanism is going to get you very far. That's why you have this weird, you said secularism earlier, Justin, and it's like people often conflate secularism and atheism, but it's funny how, while atheism might not decline, I think secularism might. You might end up with a bunch of atheists who still want to live under a sort of Christian society, which is a quite strange phenomenon.
It's not that to put together the fact and the value.
And the mistake that makes, this is crucial to me, is thinking that scientific laws somehow explain the universe instead of just describing them. It would be as though we discovered a book of Shakespeare's sonnets and said, how did that get there? And we say, I don't know. And I start studying it. And I say, well, look, I've just discovered, it follows this rhythm. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Da, 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 da. And I'm going to call that iambic pentameter, the law of iambic pentameter. How interesting. And I've also discovered this law that at the end of a sentence there's usually a little dot. That's the law of punctuation, and how after that there are two types of letters and the big letter comes next. All these laws that I'm discovering. And someone says, well, where did the book come from? And you say, well, I mean, I don't know, we haven't answered that yet, but look at how much progress we've made in uncovering the laws of literacy. Surely one day this will come to explain the origins of the literary laws themselves and the origin of the book. It's a category error, it's a total mistake.
Man, that's well said. I've never heard that before. That's really good. So yeah, saying that the law of thermodynamics, the law of gravitation, the law of this, the law of that, to say that they all function just exactly the right way to support life, wow, look at these laws. Well, yeah, those are laws, but who made the laws work? Who set the world up so that they obeyed the laws, worked under the laws in such a way that things worked out just perfectly for life? Well, that sounds like there's a Shakespeare behind the sonnet, right? There is a creator behind the creation.
That is so good. And he's made the point by telling a story, right? And giving the analogy, and he takes you into the law of literature, and he makes you see the absurdity of thinking that simply having explained laws of punctuation, you have explained the origin of the book or the meaning of the words. In the same way, in the scientific method, just because you've explained various laws by which nature tends to operate, that does not tell you the origin of the world, nor does it tell you the meaning of the world. And to imagine that exhaustively describing but they are woven together. And I think he just does a brilliant job here.
Those questions are not
that could
probably
almost
fit for scientific
that could almost come
inquiry.
from a Christian trying to put science in its box. We've chosen a very forgiving atheist on this.
An atheist who practically sounds like he believes in God. At this point.
I've got to ask. Do you feel like there is any chance if we get you back in 10 years' time, you'd have a different answer to that question?
God willing.
Notice everyone else is laughing and clapping, but to begin with, Alex isn't. And there's a sense in which obviously, like, he definitely plays that like for laughs to some degree, but he also means it. When you see his heartfelt explanations of divine hiddenness, and he talks very movingly at times of, he lived with Christians and he went to church and he's prayed and he's read scripture and he has sought for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and nothing, nada. And like he speaks very, very movingly and powerfully in those moments. And so I think when he says God willing there, it's not just a joke. Mark, if you want to have a look, here's how Alex responds to that.
She has very much been converted by the Tom Holland thesis that anything that we hold as these civic, secular virtues and values,
the Enlightenment,
come from Christianity ultimately. They don't.
Okay, so the Tom Holland thesis, Tom Holland, again, not a Christian, grew up Christian. Now he's kind of on the fence about whether he's going to believe in God, and he's kind of moving more toward a Catholic faith. I'm not quite sure where he's at. He does not convince me as being truly regenerated, but he wrote that book, Dominion, about how Christianity has changed the world, and the Western world in particular. And what Tom Holland says is human rights is a Christian invention. Caring for the poor and the underprivileged is a Christian idea. Right? When you put God on a cross, when you take the maker of all things and make him the slave of all, when you make the one who's at the top willfully choose to be at the bottom for the sake of everyone, that the bloodstream of a culture is going to change the way that the culture thinks. And so, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That is a Christian idea, certainly, and this is all bled into the culture. And so, how do you ground these things like human rights in a secular, atheistic, non-Christian society? How do you do that? As a secular person, we all might believe in human rights because it's written on our conscience, but how do we ground them intellectually in something objective? You can't if we're just matter in motion, but you can if the God of the Bible is real.
They didn't come out of the ether. They didn't come from science and reason and the Enlightenment. They came from a much more ancient source.
Which can't be true.
Well, this is where we may have at least some level of disagreement.
I need to say something atheist here, and even if this isn't quite atheist, this is the big sticking point.
Let me plug this thing back in.
Didn't come from science and reason and the Enlightenment. They came from a much more ancient source.
Which can't be true.
Well, this is where we may have at least some level of disagreement.
I need to say something atheist here, and even if this isn't quite atheist, this is the big sticking point that I have in these conversations. I'm always very, very friendly and open to the ideas that are being discussed until somebody likes to say that, Western civilization characterized by freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, characterized by capitalist economy, characterized and celebrated for its abolition of slavery and its modern social justice movements, the rights of women, the rights of homosexuals. And we're told that these come from an essentially Christian basis, as if these things do not run completely anathema, each one of them, to what's actually written in the Christian scripture.
He's really woken up at that point. He's even reaching for language like anathema.
You can't be talking about what's written in the scripture. You can't say that Paul writes that he suffers not a woman to teach and also usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Or that he writes that it's disgraceful for a woman to speak in church and she should go home and ask her husband if she has a question, which Paul probably didn't actually write, but that's just another problem with Christianity.
Paul did write that. I know that what he's talking about, but Paul wrote that.
Up in the New Testament
He's
canon.
getting going.
But and then turn around and say, but the social justice movement, the women's rights, this is all sort of essentially Christian in essence. No, this seems to run anathema to what Paul is saying. The Old Testament giving explicit, not just instructions, but permission as well on exactly how to own and buy slaves, sometimes implicitly at least, as sexual slaves, and then say that the abolitionist movement was essentially Christian in origin, as if Christianity was screaming out in its ethics for the abolition of slavery, and it just took people over 1,000 years to work that out, and during those 1,000 years, referring explicitly to the Bible Bible in order to justify slavery, and it just so happens to coincide with the Enlightenment that people realize that that's what God was sort of going after all along. I don't know. I think it's kind of, as I've said before, it's not just wrong, but also potentially offensive, at least, to the people who've established these kinds of moral improvements against the very kind of religious authoritarianism that we're now being told is responsible for those ideas in the first place.
Okay, I haven't heard this before. I haven't heard Glenn's response. I'll just say this. The basic idea of humans having inalienable rights, that's a Christian idea. It's only grounded in the Imago Dei, the image of God. But how exactly we flesh those rights out certainly goes against Scripture in many points. So a woman's right to reproductive health, as it's called, is what she calls a right to abortion. The Bible gives a woman no right to an abortion. She has no right to have her children murdered or killed. So the LGBTQ plus rights, so-called, that is not a biblical concept because the Bible unilaterally would condemn homosexual practice, and it would certainly not support transgenderism. So he's right that the rights have gone astray and gone far from the biblical text. That men and women should be equal is true, but that should look in function and practice as the same or interchangeable is also not in the Bible. Yes, it is true that women are called not to lead, and men are called who qualify to lead in the church, to be pastors and not women. That's all true. So he's right to say that a lot of the rights talk is not biblical, but the basic fundamental idea of human rights and trying to ground things in human rights is a biblical thing, even if we ground the wrong things in rights, into things that the Bible doesn't support at all. Let me hear what Glenn says.
I love Alex. That was tosh, though. That was absolute tosh. It was not the Enlightenment that overturned slavery. Oh, my goodness. If we waited for Enlightenment rationalists to abolish slavery, we would still be waiting. It was a profoundly, like every scholar of abolitionism will tell you, it was a profoundly religious movement. And the only other way that people try to escape it being Christian preachers, especially Quakers and evangelicals, driving the abolitionist movement, the only alternative thesis to that really was is just kind of an economic one. People don't really say it was the Enlightenment that actually overturned slavery. It wasn't the Enlightenment. It was not in any way, shape, or form Enlightenment rationalists who were ending slavery. Now, Alex can very well bring up the utter hypocrisy of Christian slave owners, and that is indeed a hypocrisy, and it's vile, and it's awful, and there was very much two-way traffic.
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue of the Bible and slavery is a complicated one, and that's not a way of avoiding the issue. I don't want to avoid it. You've got at least three kinds of slavery. You've got Old Testament Hebrew slavery, you've got first century Roman slavery, and you've got the African slave trade. Those are three categorically different things. We happen to have the misfortune of calling them all slavery. But, I mean, yeah. But I'm trying to think of an analogy that's an unfortunate thing. So the West African slave trade is not endorsed by Scripture, by either testament. So Exodus 21 says, whoever steals a man and sells him, the one who buys him, they shall both be put to death. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 to 11 talks about it condemns a lot of sins, but it includes in that enslavers, which is someone who steals a person to sell them into slavery. So both testaments condemn that. At least in Exodus 21, it would at least apply between Hebrews who had Hebrew slaves, and in the New Testament, it would apply to all Christians who were involved in any of this kind of stuff, or non-Christians for that matter. Don't steal someone and sell them into slavery. So the whole West African slave trade, whether it was going to Europe or whether it was going to the colonies, it was all based in man-stealing. So it's condemned. It's not a Christian practice. Hebrew slavery in the Old Testament, between Hebrews and Hebrews, you had all kinds of legal protections for the slave. If you knock the tooth out, you let the slave go. They got to celebrate holidays. They got legal protection. They got all kinds of things in that society. No other society at the time had that kind of stuff that I know of. If a slave ran away from his master and was found, the slave was automatically not forced to go back. In fact, you weren't allowed to send the slave back because the idea was if he had to run away, probably the most likely reason was because his slave master was bad. In the colonial slavery, in our state of Georgia, of all shameful things, If a slave got caught running away from his slave master, he got sent back and probably beaten and whatever all. It was in the actual laws of Georgia. I don't remember the details. I read it a long time ago. But that's not the same thing. So you've got the African slave trade is race-based, lifelong. There were very little legal protection for slaves. There were no holidays, no protections. You could beat your slave, whip your slave. You could do all kinds of stuff to your slave. Hebrew slavery is categorically different with all the protections that God sets in there. Yeah, there's a lot more that could be said on that.
True, and it's necessary at times. But to point out that actually Christians were the ones driving the abolition of the slave trade is just fact.
Yeah, that's true.
All right. The underlying...
I'm done here. I don't even know what all that was. That was fun. All right, I'm done here. Thank you for watching.